Greetings, everyone. Marty, thanks for joining us. Marty Liccardo has joined with us several times in the last year. Did a two-part series on men's engagement and looking at the culture of working with men and boys in the primary prevention of intimate partner violence. Marty works at the Utah Department of Health. I seem to remember on one of your other bios, Marty, that you've been there over 15 years or so. As stated, he was with us in the fall and will expand on what we learned at that time. At the time, some of the top points that Marty had brought up was that 98% of all perpetrators of intimate partner violence are men. Men and boys can be an active solution in changing this problem. Changing this culture and teaching men and boys that they can help be a part of the solution will improve violence against women, men's health, self-harm and suicide, disconnection from self or others, and sexism, misogyny, and privilege. Marty, I will let you tell your specialties and the rest of the things that you do so well. And we welcome you. Please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much. And I think actually this will be a good complement to the start by belief. At the very least, it'll in some ways be a kind of a photo negative of the presentation you just saw in terms of like what works and what doesn't, how we talk to folks about interpersonal violence in general, but how we start to reframe this issue in a way that is palatable. And I actually think this is a fairly timely spot for this discussion in general, given the prominence and the growth of movements like Start by Believing and some of the progress, but understanding kind of how they got to a place where we could have these programs. But I'll go into that in some detail too. Again, I always like to say, feel free to interrupt me with questions. And if someone could monitor the chat too, I'm not a multitasker personally. But I wanted to reframe the problem and how we think about the problem of moving towards healthier communities as it relates to violence and interpersonal violence prevention. My career and a lot of my work contemporarily is working with men, but really it's working with a subject that from a lot of our biases, misconceptions, and social norms, we have some problematic thinking about, and how do we reframe that in a way that moves us closer to us having less sexual violence in our communities and our cultures. And Start by Believing is actually a great campaign for this for a variety of different reasons, so that you'll see how this complements as we start moving forward. Again, curiosity is always the goal of any kind of topic I talk about. I hope that you have more questions than answers when we're done talking today. I hope to muddy this topic for you a little, not make more sense. Because I think part of the problem too is thinking we have simple, quick, or easy answers, or that we just need to tell some people things, when in reality, we just need to understand sometimes the barriers to moving us forward in this issue are deeper than just an educational framing. We need to fix some other things, maybe some things structurally or socially or culturally that are getting in the way of the educational efforts we're doing. And again, hopefully we'll begin with some small amount of action you can take, because I always like giving people a little homework. I'm kind of kidding, you're not going to get homework, but hopefully some ways to start incorporating some of these ideas into your day-to-day work or into your community. Okay, let's see. So I wanted to start by saying, when we talk about this too, we tend to, if I had one goal for today, it was that we stop othering. I don't think I told this story last time, I'm not sure, but one time I was asked to do a presentation at the University of Utah for a class, for like a social work class on domestic violence. And I'm not an expert on domestic violence. I'm an expert on interpersonal violence prevention. So I know a lot about domestic violence, but I didn't think I was the perfect fit. And this student kept calling me and saying, I don't have anybody. So they finally, I acquiesced and said, I can come in and sit on this panel. And as I sat down, I looked next to me and there was a Salt Lake Police Department sex detective who worked on domestic violence, and a person who worked at the YWCA of Salt Lake who was a case manager and caseworker for domestic violence. And I thought to myself, I'm the least educated and prepared on this panel to talk about this, which I thought was funny. But invariably within the first few minutes, somebody said, why would somebody stay in these relationships? And all of the experts on this panel started answering the question perfectly, that there are a bunch of different circumstances that would encourage a person to stay in a violent or unhealthy relationship, like financial burdens that they couldn't get out of, if there were children, feelings for the partner and not wanting to end the relationship and what that meant, just a variety of understandable complications that many of us, if you're in this training, I'm sure you know and have thought about. And I'm watching all these college students nod their heads. Oh, that's why a person would stay in a violent relationship. And it frustrated me because when they, after they were done kind of sharing, I said, let me ask you all a question. Has anybody in this room ever stayed in a relationship longer than they should have? And every hand should have gone up, but almost every hand did, because we've all had this experience where we stayed in a situation or environment. If I asked the question differently, it said, have you ever stayed in a job too long? Have you ever stayed in a friendship even, maybe not romantic too long? All of us would have an experience where our boundaries were violated, or someone we felt manipulated, or there were problems or unhealthy things. So the problem inherent is that we think we are different as providers or support systems or people who work in this field, or even educators, that we see ourselves as different from survivors that we work with. When in reality, we've all been victims of unhealthy relationships or mistreatment, or a variety of other abusive or trauma-oriented things. And so when we start realizing like we're all part of this or in this together, and it's not that we were a victim of trauma, it's that trauma and violence are oftentimes a normal part of our culture or society, or can be in some ways. So how do we start challenging that? And stop just focusing on an individual's behavior or choices? We need to look more broadly, not just at those choices or behaviors, because sometimes those things can make people feel safer or better, but how do we focus on this more broadly? And that's what we're going to get into today. And I like that narrative too, because it forced me to ask myself that question as well. Am I sometimes othering victims or othering perpetrators? And I'll talk to you about that in a second, because we often fail to, in our prevention and intervention efforts, discuss the perpetration aspects of this, which really, if you want to know what primary prevention of sexual violence is, it's not start by believing. I mean, it is. That's a good, I enjoyed that connection there, but it's also trying to prevent perpetration before it happens. And that's where we should be focusing. We've spent about 20, 30, 2,000, 10,000 years focusing on victim behavior in this field. What we need to start doing is thinking about perpetrator behavior. I just want to throw out that I like the public health approach to this, because although we like to focus on individuals and individual behaviors, I want us to start thinking relationally, communally, and societally, structurally. Like, how are those things impacting our understanding and what parts of the society are barriers to violence prevention, and what part are protective factors, enhancers for healthy relationships. A couple things to chew on as we're starting to meeting people where they are versus holding people accountable. So I see very often that we talk about cancel culture today, and people have a variety of different reactions and feelings about cancel culture and how horrible or wonderful or evil or great it is. And what I would say is I once heard the term, instead of calling people out for doing things that are culturally, socially, interpersonally inappropriate, what we should be doing is calling people in. And this is a really important idea to me that I hope we can start incorporating in great ways. When somebody does something or says something or acts in a way you think is inappropriate or wrong-headed or not healthy, how could you call that person, invite that person into a conversation about making these things healthier? Or how could you invite them to resources instead of condemning them for the behavior or the problem? Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. That idea, I think, is really valuable. And I will also tie this into just behavior change theory and research on behavior change, that some people respond to negative reinforcement. I don't want to say nobody does, but far more people respond to positive reinforcement and support. Just like Start by Believing is a great example of this, that instead of asking a person why they got themselves into this situation, we start by saying, oh, you need help and support because you feel something bad happened to you. Let's do that. You can see why that all of a sudden the data will show a person's recovery is faster. Their ability to readapt and reacquaint into normal everyday life is faster. So what we want to do is say, like, there is a component of this that we need to think about related to how do we invite people into this instead of challenging people for not doing it perfectly. Have an empathy for defensiveness. And this rolls into a lot of the work I do related to men and men's engagement. But we right now, and by the way, I think that the hostility and anger and is righteous associated with histories of sexism, of racism, of homophobia, of trans, all of the feelings come from places of very righteous anger. But understanding that when a person is defensive, it's often because they don't understand or don't know how to change behavior or don't know how to fix it. So I actually got this term from a victim advocate at Hill Air Force Base who, after talking, we did a presentation on men's accountability, and she said, I have a deeper empathy for men's defensiveness now. I think I understand it better. And to me, that's the whole point of that call-in idea. If we understand where their defensiveness is coming from, we don't take it personally, and we can actually start moving forward. And really, oftentimes that defensiveness isn't directed at you. It's a response to feeling cornered or feeling responsible. So hopefully that idea makes sense, but just something to think about, that if we have an empathy for defensiveness instead of a reactivity for it, we can move a conversation along. Vulnerability is an action, is a behavior. We sometimes see vulnerability as as a passive thing. It actually is a very active idea. Being vulnerable means stepping into some of these uncomfortable places. So that means for us, and it also means for the people we're trying to talk to about these issues, whether it's a patient, whether it's a patient's family member who's responding poorly to ideas and facts about interpersonal violence. Thinking about kindness as a radical act. I think that's something we all need to think about as we move forward in this field. Understanding that privilege is structural and societal, not individual. And I put the word sometimes there because sometimes people can exercise privilege in really unhealthy, inappropriate individual ways. But understanding that the concepts of male privilege, white privilege, able-bodied privilege, these are structural and societal ideas, and so how they are experienced. And we'll talk about this as well, because privilege is not all, it is often unobserved and unexperienced by the people who adopt privileged identities. That is a very complicated thing. So oftentimes too, when I see people throw around you're exercising your privilege, or you're totally privileged, and a person says, I don't feel privileged, I have a lot of really hard things in my life, we have a disconnect there instead of trying to find a place of meaning and moving forward. So again, when we talk about what vulnerability is and why vulnerability is important, I'm going to challenge you all and say that vulnerability is not just important for the people who we're working with, our patients, our community members, the people we're trying to educate. It's important for us. And we all, as people talking about interpersonal violence, prevention, intervention, or treatment, or support, need to be thinking about how we are using vulnerability in a good or healthy way, or how we're using it in an unhealthy way. And being vulnerable, using vulnerability versus being vulnerable or being in a place to be harmed by it. Again, just some ideas to think about. Okay. So privilege is really complicated. How do we discuss privilege and equity when individuals don't experience privilege and equity in the same way that you or I, or even they, experience oppression? So you could talk to somebody who is in a really, really bad financial place, but they are also a white person. How do they experience this privilege versus also being told that because they're white, they're experiencing this great situation? If they're experiencing it from a point of oppression, they're not going to listen to you. So how do we talk about privilege in all of its complexities? And as we start to talk about intersectionality of privilege in a few minutes, you'll start to hopefully think about this and unpack this even further, that I often think it's funny. We are, I would say, in general, a lot of these conversations and work related to interpersonal violence right now comes out of progressive thought, because progressive communities are the ones who are kind of pushing these ideas and shifting it. But and so in progressive communities, we tend to not like binaries, this or that. Really simple answers. It's this way or it's that way. But for some reason with privilege, we tend to talk about it in this really narrow format, that privilege is either something you have or something you don't, when in reality, it's far more nuanced and complicated than that. So let's dismantle a little bit, or blur the issue of privilege binary, because privilege doesn't work that way. And so part of it is also understanding too, how do we understand privilege for ourselves, and how that impacts a person's ability to access health, ability to live a healthy lifestyle, experience growing up, and what were those barriers before, but also how are we using it in a way to progress health and safety, and how are we using it in a way to punish people for not understanding something, for not understanding how privilege relates to health and safety. Okay. Additionally, just consciousness. I use the word consciousness here. I'm saying wokeness or awareness, or being in a place where we have this knowledge and information is a privilege in and of itself. The notion of understanding how interpersonal violence works, how health equity works, how social determinants of health, what ACEs, adverse childhood experiences are, all of this, these points of understanding are areas of privilege as well. We didn't just, I was not born and understood how, social norms and slut shaming worked. Someone had to tell me that. Someone had to even inform me that I was participating in sexist behavior when I was in junior high and high school, so that I was able to check it, challenge it, and reframe it. And you can imagine like how you approached me at that time and told me I was a sexist pig would have informed how I responded and reacted to that information. Again, this is that call out versus call in kind of idea. So what doesn't work when we're talking about how to bring and invite people into these kinds of conversations? So you're the issue, accountability, and responsibility. So saying that you're the problem or you're the issue is not a really helpful or effective way for most people to invite them into these conversations. When people feel attacked, targeted, or labeled, they do not tend to respond in a place where they want to continue to invite ideas or dialogue. So this is an area where we need to start to think about this. Now I'll tell you, I was doing a presentation similar to this or on this topic once for a bunch of victim advocates, and they got very angry at this slide in particular, where they said, but what about the people who are perpetrating these ideas, these notions, these frameworks? Like, shouldn't they be held accountable? And I said, yes, they should. But if we are like, and on an individual basis, if my friends, family, or people on an individual dialoguing basis say some of these things, I challenge it immediately. And I think it's important to figure out ways to have those kinds of conversations. But when we understand that sometimes these issues are broader or more structural, how do we get people to move along? Because one of the things I want to throw out to you all as an idea is, one of the curses and benefits of having privileged identities or experiencing privileged privilege in society is that I get to turn this off when I want to. So if I have white male privilege, which I would identify as I do, and someone challenges me with the notion of gender discrimination, or talks to me about the different cultural norms related to sex and sexual safety, I could just say, you're wrong, and walk away, because privilege allows me to not have to think about this or encounter it for the most part. So what I would want to do is, although it feels like in some ways we're letting folks off the hook, trying to figure out how to keep people engaged in that conversation and figure out ways to have them identify being a part of this, or being a component of the solution to these problems, but keeping them involved in the work in that community or in that family or in that society is a much better approach. So understand too that people believe many of the social norms and myths surrounding sexual violence too. So although we are in a place now that's very different than we were 20, 30, or 40 years ago in our understanding on victimization and perpetration and what constitutes sexual harassment or sexual assault or rape, we have I would say the work of many, mostly women, but many women and men and people in general over the last few years is important, but understanding that like that culture change and cultural change attitudes move slower than a lot of other things, so that we still have some of these myths culturally and socially normalized. And again, whenever people ask me what does that mean, or how do I know that, I always say, even contemporarily, if you can find me a TV commercial with a man doing housework, either cleaning or vacuuming or doing dishes, that doesn't have that as a major component to like, look at this man doing housework, I would be very surprised. I have almost never seen that. Still in 2021, that we see women as homemakers. This is something that has been habitually normalized, and even to the extent that like we know men do more than that in terms of housework in the homes, but when they're selling products, we still normalize it that way. This is one of those areas that like, even though it's silly to think of women as doing that work. And by the way, I do also rationalize that women still do the bulk of the heavy lifting when it comes to parenting and housework statistically. This is also part of that problem. And by the way, this is also an interest. I use this as I'm saying this example, I'm thinking COVID-19 is even more profound as we start to think about these issues, because not only was that burden already greater when our governments asked us to keep our children at home, and then we needed to do childcare, probably still work from home if we could. Many people had to work outside the home, but those obligations doubled, tripled, and quadrupled, which thinking about that impact on their health and safety is really critical. And then if we could start to think about intersectionality and how that relates to domestic violence or sexual violence within the home, it gets very complicated. Okay, I went off on a weird tangent there, but anyway, let's see. Okay, so I just want to start to point out, and I'm not going to go into this example in too much detail, but just say that biases and norms are really powerful and impactful indicators of our behavior that, and I use sex as an example because when I ask this question of most people, now a lot of you are healthcare people, so it will probably be a little bit easier to answer, but when I ask the question of what is sex, it often takes me 5 to 10 minutes to get a group of adults to tell me the definition of sex. And oftentimes they say things like, when a guy puts his body parts in a woman, because we have very low vocabulary. We have turned a lot of anatomical words into culturally sex negative words and like inappropriate words, when penis and vagina are not inappropriate. We've decided that they are. So we have a cultural norm about that. It usually takes me a long time to get people to make this definition, and trying to get people to talk about it is even more difficult, especially as it relates to how people, individuals, families, communities, cultures, and societies deal with sex, because some cultures have a far more open attitude about talking about sex in polite culture. Some cultures never talk about it. But this also is an individual and a relational and family difference as well. Like, this is one of those topics that's really complicated, because I'm sitting right now on a committee to try and introduce comprehensive sex ed to Utah. Now, this might be very controversial with the people who are listening to this presentation. This might not be very controversial, but I'll tell you, in Utah, it's a controversial issue for a whole host of reasons. And although some of us think we have simple answers, this would help us, it would reduce teenage pregnancy, it would increase healthy relationships, it would decrease violence, except that for a lot of folks in the state, that the costs of introducing these ideas are too great, or they worry about potential consequences. So how do we do this in a way that meets everybody's needs, promotes healthy societies, but also doesn't mess with people's cultural or social ideas of what is right or wrong? I like the topic of sex because it is so complicated, and there isn't one right or wrong answer. It's very differentiated. And so how do we think about this in relation to, we can't even talk about what's healthy sexually. How do we talk about what's unhealthy sexually? How do we talk about victimization when we've made it so hard to even talk about the subject in and of itself? So this is one of those things we work on too, is how do we find spaces and places to talk about and normalize talking about some of these things, so we can talk about healthy and safe ways of participating in relationships or with people, instead of talking about the negative stuff, and then warning and scaring people about the potential outcomes. I hope this has been, I'm realizing as I'm saying this, like, this is just, it's very, very complicated, and it's not getting less complicated. So when we talk about intersectionality, understanding social determinants of health, health equity, social norms, and cultural humility or competency practices. What I want to say too, is we talk about social determinants of health and we talk about health equity. if you don't know what those terms, after this training, I think you do, and I think even the next step when we talk about risk and protective factors, all of these are related to understanding not only just the barriers of just access to health information, health resources, but understanding that those barriers are not the same for people in different places and spaces, or even the same for people within our communities. That even people, I live in Salt Lake City, so even people in Salt Lake don't have the same access to healthcare that other people who live in Salt Lake have. So if we're really talking about intersectionality, of course, things like race and gender, sexual orientation or sexual identity, gender identity play major roles, but a bunch of other things play roles as well in terms of determining people's access and support systems. And increasing those for everybody is really important. I just wanted to throw in here too the concept of victim-centered versus trauma-informed versus perpetrator prevention, that we are moving towards a victim-centered and trauma-informed approach to how we deal with interpersonal violence. These are both very good things. They are very, very important things. But we also need to start a very uncomfortable conversation about perpetrator prevention. Perpetrator prevention is better than perpetrator intervention, which we have a lot of data, resources, organizations, and groups that work with perpetrator intervention, especially as it relates to domestic violence, and then to some degree when it relates to sexual violence. But we also need to start to talk about what perpetrator prevention looks like in that little triangle of victim-centered and trauma-informed, because perpetrator prevention should be an equal part of that, to try and move towards understanding what are risk factors to perpetration, what are preventive factors to preventing perpetration. But we often don't like talking about perpetrators. We like that binary of like, someone who commits an act of sexual violence is a monster and they're awful and they're terrible. And I wish that were the case, because what they did was awful and terrible, and I don't want to diminish that. But what I also want to say is they're not disappearing. They're part of our communities. They're sometimes even part of our families or social groups. And that makes this more complicated. So it's even more reason we need to start talking about this and shifting our understanding of it. That we tend to have a very simple view of this. It's more complex than that. And again, just understanding social determinants. This is Dr. Kamara Phyllis-Jones' description of like primary, secondary, tertiary prevention. I talked about this last time, so I don't want to go into detail, but she also goes into social determinants of health framework, where she says, but the problem is, if it were that simple, primary, secondary, tertiary of the fence, the net, or the ambulance, the problem is that some people don't have any of those fences, nets, or ambulances, and some people are closer to the hill than others, and this might mean they don't have health insurance, or their communities don't have hospitals close by, or there are a variety of other barriers associated. There's violence within their community, so they can't access recreation because it's not safe out of their houses. A lot of different things, but understanding social determinants of health broadens our view and asks us to move from looking at that individual behavior to that broader community and societal issues. Again, we talked really briefly about social norms, values, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors related to really everything, but in this case, we're talking about interpersonal violence. One of my favorite exercises on this is not in the interest of time. I have a longer one, but in the interest of time, I'm going to do a shorter one. When we talk about social norms, or how social norms relate to our understanding of risk behavior, there's an exercise where I would say, if I were to ask you all in this group, if it's possible that someday you might get cancer, would you think that that's a possibility for you? If you would, I would hope most of you would agree it's possible you might someday get cancer. Yeah. Oh, the thumbs up's helpful. Yeah. Is it possible someday that you all might get heart disease? Is that something that could happen to you at some point in your life? Of course it is. And so then I would ask the question, is it possible that you might develop alcohol or drug dependency? You might become an addict someday. What we often see at this point is that number of people willing to raise their hand drops precipitously. And it's because when we think of addiction, we tend to think of it as a behavioral or a choices issue. And when we think of heart disease and cancer, we think of it as something that happens to you. But really, what do all three of those things have in common? They are all caused by a genetic predisposition or some kind of genetic issue, there's a behavioral component to them, oftentimes, not always, but sometimes behaviorally or environmentally. And then, so behaviorally, there's a condition, genetically, and also environmentally. What is the environment you're in? And the interesting thing to me is, oftentimes when I ask groups of people, absolutely, yeah, I could get heart disease. Yeah, absolutely, so I could get skin cancer or some kind of cancer that I didn't know I could get. But if you ask about addiction, people will say no, and you're like, and the difference there is all three of those things are caused by these same factors. We just have a cultural and social reaction to addiction. And again, I do know that those things are different, but I also want us to think about those similarities too, where if we actually started treating addiction in the same way, and we're starting to see this, right? We're looking at medical models of this. We will start to see more people seeking treatment and support, more avenues and support for people who are impacted by drugs or alcohol, instead of looking at it as like a social ill or a behavioral issue or a personality trait that is a problem. And again, like those two things are really critical when we start seeing like the health behavior that is good for you is a good thing, and the one that's bad for you is a bad thing. And we need to stop personalizing it and making this about the person who's impacted by it. So understanding that social norms associated with all these things, especially related to sexual violence, we need to unlearn a lot of them. We have a lot of normalized mythology and belief systems associated with sexual violence that are not true. And again, if you want to go way back to just slut shaming kind of things, or like when a woman wears something, when she went to this party where there was alcohol and she was in high school, what did she expect? These kinds of myth and mythos, even though we know they're not true, still stick in our heads and are still played out in a variety of different ways, culturally and socially. So how do we start the process of, we're not in a place to start learning new stuff. We need to start unlearning the inappropriate stuff and start catching ourselves when we believe those kinds of things. Social norms influence behavior, and this is something that's really critical to understand, that many social norms can influence people's behavior. Norms are often misperceived, over or underestimated by the majority. Misperceptions encourage people misperceptions encourage people to believe those kinds of false norms, so what we want to do is challenge those misperceptions and teach what is correct, because most people will do the healthy or right thing when faced with those opportunities. So really important to think about. Individuals will, correcting misperceptions allows individuals to correct those beliefs. Sorry, you all, your pictures are covering the bottom of my slide, so I was paraphrasing. Okay. All right, Elizabeth Smart example of this is one of my favorites. But before I even do that, let me say there was a good example of how cultural norms can impact behavior. When I worked at the University of Maryland, I used to work at the University of Maryland, and there were 2 campus bars that had a drink special if you could prove it was your 21st birthday, where they would give you a really cheap price to try and drink 21 shooters, which is a little less alcohol than a shot, but 21 shooters on your 21st birthday. And students would come in the next day with hash marks on their arms for how many drinks they got. It was a terrible environment for high risk drinking and binge drinking when I worked at that campus. But one of the things I kept saying to folks was like, the cultural norm of doing this rite of passage at the University of Maryland was influencing and encouraging the high risk behavior. Now, some students would still drink high risk, but this specific thing was something that everybody began to be like, I can't wait till my 21st birthday because I can go to this bar and try this. So understanding like that kind of cultural influence, one of the first things we did was try to get the bars to stop doing that. Just not offer the special. Try and challenge that notion. Elizabeth Smart gave a great example of this related to IPV, interpersonal violence, where she said that she was speaking at an international conference on victimization, and she said that one of the things she had been taught from a very young age is we live in a fairly sexually conservative state. I think if you live in Utah, you would all agree with that. And that she got messages when she was younger from both her school and some of the ecclesiastical training she got that said, there were some object lessons they talked about where they would hand around a flower and each student would pull off a petal. And then at the end, they'd say, see, when you engage in sexual activity before you're married, this is inappropriate. Or they would do some of these object lessons with chewing gum, where they would have people put a piece of gum in their mouth and then offer it to the neighbor and they'd go, ew. So again, problematic in general for a whole host of reasons. But one of the things Elizabeth Smart talked about was that when she was kidnapped, she felt like she was kind of worthless and useless, and she had been used up because she had been sexually assaulted, she had been raped. And so it prevented her from seeking support and help. So, this goes into that example of the start by believing example. That's why it's so critically important to start doing that, to start shifting that narrative and moving towards that in general. And it's a really useful thing Elizabeth Smart did by sharing that for us, and challenging these notions of like, don't use sex negativity to or don't victim blame in an effort to try and support your education's on healthy sexuality or healthy relationships. How do we start to balance that out? And again, that example for her was it prevented her from reaching out for help as soon because she thought she wasn't worth helping. So how do we make sure we go? I still think for some families and communities and ecclesiastical groups, they think don't have sex before marriage. I think that's fine if that's the teachings and education and community standards you want to have, as long as we're not using those as opportunities to make it harder for victims to come forward. How do we do both and? How do we still maintain community standards without harming the people who could be harmed by people who perpetrate sexual violence? So again, what does accountability look like for us moving forward in this when it comes to education, when it comes to intervention, and what would accountability look like for violence in a just world where we started really holding people accountable for violence? So again, that would look like bystander intervention trainings, which I'd like to see a lot more of. I think bystander intervention offers us opportunities to really challenge not just some of the problematic behavior related to sexual and interpersonal violence, but also related to those precursors to interpersonal violence, the sexist language, the inappropriate reactions to people's faiths, so anti-Semitic comments or anti-Muslim comments or anti-Christian, all of these are problems. And bystander intervention offers us a path to start addressing those on a cultural and social level and even more broadly. I will also say I like the idea of using a strength-based approach. We have to define what is healthy if we're going to start talking about what isn't healthy. We have to educate on what is healthy. If we're going to educate on what's not healthy, we have to start talking and using research on what's healthy, doing research on what's healthy and what's not. This begins to be a real big problem that we have to, one of my favorite frames for this was somebody once said to me in a training, you can't do a don't. You can tell people not to use drugs. Absolutely. Although, again, that answer gets very complicated. But you can say, don't underage drink, but you then have to talk about what is, when they hit 21, what is technically considered appropriate or healthy or community standard behavior, or what is considered healthy by our community, or et cetera. But you have to talk about these kinds of things, because just giving someone a reason to not do something isn't enough. It's not useful, especially as they start to navigate some of the more culturally tricky issues associated with adolescence and even adulthood. Understanding risk and protective factors and figuring out what those things are, and actually doing research to collect those kinds of things. What are risk factors for violence in our community? What are protective factors within our community, and how do we enhance and support those? One of the things I often think about is community connectedness, and I think, how do we make sure we're doing that in all parts of our community? What does that look like, and what's our accountability? I also just want to say, as we talk about accountability earlier, let me just say that it's interesting to me. I said to a friend the other day, and again, I told you a minute ago, I live in Salt Lake City, and we have a fairly significant issue with homelessness right now in the city. And I said, if everybody in Salt Lake, or everybody in Salt Lake County, or everybody in Utah, every time they saw one homeless person, felt a level of obligation to fix that problem, I think we would solve this a lot sooner. Instead of normalizing and looking at folks who are experiencing homelessness, even though there's a variety of complex reasons homelessness happens to a variety of people, including, by the way, domestic violence, escaping a home and live. We have an unfortunate number of mothers and probably fathers living in their cars with their kids to escape violent relationships, that you start to see, like, how do we look at this as anything that's affecting members of community are part of our accountability? That, to me, it takes work and takes some personal, social, and political capital to start to address. Okay. And intersections of all of these things related to sexual violence, domestic violence, pornography, sexist attitudes, physical violence, all of the interpersonal violence issues, how do they relate to these other areas of intersectionality that we talked about, as they relate to whiteness, as they relate to people of color, as they relate to LGBTQIA folks in the community. All these intersections are really complicated and critical. And what are a couple of things you could do today to start to challenge and solve this? What are those things? I don't know. To me, these are questions I ask myself, with some regularity. What is one or two things I can do to make my community safer for people, to make my community healthier? And then can I identify and target people who are in vulnerable or marginalized communities within my community? And what can I do as an individual? What can I do as a broader member of the community? What can I ask my legislators or law enforcement or our civil and community resource organizations to do? Like, how are we moving forward in this on an individual, but also a structural level? So I wanted to leave time for questions. I know I took about a 10,000 foot view on this issue. I didn't get too nitty gritty, but when we think about accountability in these programs and these processes, especially as it relates to interpersonal violence, what I often see is people talking about us and them, whether it's perpetrators or victims or whoever. And what I'd love us to start doing as a community of people who care and are working on this issue is to start thinking, what do I need to also do? What risk factors am I holding on to that are preventing me from engaging in this work in a more meaningful way? Whether it's with my patients or broader with the state I live in or the country I live in, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks, Marty.
Yeah.
I think one of the take homes for me that you have reiterated, but in the past programming, is really the defensiveness of men and boys and kind of our social norms, and understanding what those are when we're reacting to somebody. And if we come from that perspective of understanding where people are coming from, and then try that pulling in rather than the fighting back. It's a really, really difficult thing to do, but I do think that there'll be no movement if we can't just like have that conversation and realize that it's not it feels very personal, because it is. I mean, like behavior that is inappropriate, and sexual harassment or any kind of situation where you feel threatened, it's very appropriate to call that person out, but at the same time, somehow find ways to address it. I will say that I was in a situation one time where I was volunteering at one of those 10K mud events, up in Park City, where they do the whole course, and people were really dirty, and I was behind a table, and we were handing out water and various things, and this one guy came up and was like, "Oh, I'm gonna hug you," and I'm like, "Oh, no. I'm okay." And he ended up, I kept on saying no. He's like, "Oh, come on, yeah." He ended up jumping over the table behind my space. I'm like, "I'm telling you right now, I do not want you to touch me." And he still took and he embraced my whole body. And it was so uncomfortable. It was so uncomfortable. And I think about, what could I have done differently? I did every single thing that I was supposed to do. And yet he still did it. And, I went and talked to the course people, and I didn't know his name or anything. But I think when I think about what you're saying is, I did everything I could at the moment. The people that were around me were doing what we could at the moment. But what I can do is, in situations, when I'm having just general conversations with people about X, Y, and Z, I can say, "Oh, I've had this event happen to me before. This is how it made me feel. And I'm wondering, what would be something that I could do, or how could I stop that?" Or and talking about these issues that we sometimes experience, and finding out from other men. A lot of people are like, "Oh yeah, there's so many jerks," but there are. I don't know where you go from there, but not take it personally that person had a problem, but that could have been a very violent behavior had I been in a different environment.
Well, and we're in a place too where everybody around you. Who knows? This to me is like, what a great example of, I'm sorry that happened to you, by the way, before I say, what a great example for a bystander intervention scenario to go, what could you have done? What could people around you have done? What could organizers do in the future to make sure that like people have respect for boundaries and you know, some people might say, well, that's such a small example. All it was a hug, but it's also going like, well, we're creating a standard and opportunity for someone to violate boundaries and like think that it was culturally or socially appropriate to do it when it wasn't. And this to me is a great place to even just hearing that narrative, I would say tells anybody in this space, especially men in this space, who might have issues associated with entitlement related to that, that this is an inappropriate thing and shouldn't happen. And that it has an impact too, that like it goes far beyond that. Like now you have this, like anytime another person tries to hug you like that, I imagine they're going to get if you put your hands on me, I'm gonna, you know, scream or kick you or something like, which is an appropriate reaction to what you experience. And these are, and so like, but I also like the idea of being like, what are the opportunities going forward for the that narrative that the people running that event could in the future also make an announcement that like, understand we had an issue with boundary violations in the past, and we want people to not do that. Like listen to how people want to be treated, especially our event organizers or our support or our volunteers and other people. The minimization too of people's experiences instead of actually trying to understand it. When I say call out and call in too, that's a great example of one of those too, of someone being like, what's the big deal? That to me is also an act of boundary violation too, to minimize someone's experience with something. I hope that the narrative I told about Elizabeth Smart, one of the things I think is so critical about that too is I don't think anybody who is educating her on healthy sexual relationships was trying to harm her or trying to put her in a vulnerable situation. Like part of it too is like that level of empathy too, to go, my guess is anybody who did a presentation for her and said that feels pretty damn terrible right now. And to me saying like, that's not particularly useful either, except to say like, how do we make sure you go, well, let's move forward and not create spaces where we are ever making it difficult for a survivor to come forward and get help, or by the way, for a perpetrator to come forward and say, I've done inappropriate things in the past and I don't want to do that again. I don't know. I hope this has been helpful. I feel like I went a little broad, but like, how do we start to hold ourselves accountable as people trying to do this work to do it in the most effective and useful way possible? And that is something I'm still working on.
So Marty, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you do this as your full-time job and your education is very specific. So those of us that are just out there this isn't our only job. I'm having a lot of thoughts of how you introduce things for a culture change, right? Because if you go into the high school or you go into the university and you post flyers and send out things that say, come learn about, you know, sexual assault or appropriate behavior or whatever you title it, you've already limited the amount of people that are going to come. Mm-hmm. In my experience with youth, at least. So how do you incorporate, or what suggestions might you have on how you incorporate that education and maybe some other thing that you're already teaching about without crossing the line of, I didn't sign up for this. What are you talking about this for? Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And it's a very difficult thing to do. I will tell you that one of the reasons we're moving to more of a strength-based framework in talking about what people should be doing instead of what they shouldn't is not only do we have some data that says when you talk about rape mythology or mistruths or falsehoods about health behavior, it reinforces them if they're messages that people are getting in other places. But also what I would say is the best bet is to create spaces where you can have these kinds of conversations that are in more natural environments, because I think you're right. No, if you say we're going to have a rape prevention presentation at the library tomorrow, who would show up to that presentation? 40 women would pile into a room and ask, how do I not get sexually assaulted? When prevention would be 40 men piling into that room and asking what we can do to have healthier relationships with our families and our wives and our kids and ourselves, even between other men. And again, you get my bias and focus on healthy versus unhealthy masculinity there. But to me, creating spaces to have these, I'll give you a great example. One of the things I am trying to get places to move away from, and again, I think that rape crisis centers and DV shelters have great educators. This is not me trying to condemn or criticize, but this is going to be a little controversial, especially for those folks who work in DV shelters or sexual violence prevention places. I would rather, instead of having an educator go into the schools once a year and teaching rape prevention in all 8 health classes at that high school that day, I would much rather have a more intensive training for all of the teachers on how to think about, respond, understand violence, dating violence and domestic violence or sexual assault, so that when it came up naturally and organically in the news, or somebody was playing a video game, or a student said something inappropriate in class, it can be an opportunity to talk about this is inappropriate, or what is inappropriate, and how it might relate to violence, instead of relying on, because I will tell you, it's funny, I think my bio said 15 years. I realized I haven't updated my bio. It's been 22 years of doing this work. And in that time, I've talked to a lot of classes and high school, junior high groups of kiddos. And when you're coming in from that perspective, like the educators tend to rely on you as the expert on this issue. When I would say, we're all experts on how to treat other people and how to have healthier relationships, or how to communicate, dignity to myself and to other people. So to me, the one of the things I'd like to start doing is seeing us say, are we mandating that our community, are the educators in our schools get some kind of training from the organizations in our communities? So are rape crisis centers not just going to classes, but are their educators going into teachers trainings and conferences and things like that? Are they going into ecclesiastical trainings and other places like that? That are there other opportunities for us to have a broader reach and do less work? Like, I'd much rather have an educator go talk to every teacher in the district than every student, because every teacher in the district has more opportunities to educate and talk and train. Go to and talk to every parent, because they're going to start educating their kids and socializing with their kids' friends and seeing some kind of things. I don't know if this is helpful, but your question's really good. That in some ways, I wish we could all start to become broader experts on our expectations and societal and community standards than relying on community experts like someone like me who's been doing this or does it full time, where I don't think I'm necessarily better or worse at this than you all are. I might have thought of a few ways to talk about it differently. And for that reason, invite me to your, PTA meeting or Communities That Care Coalition or something else. And I'll happily do more kind of working on and talking and framing of this stuff with folks who want to start these conversations. And maybe that also means looking at your community and like who in your community are kind of support and expert people who want to start talking about this or broadening it. I'm a big proponent now of just creating different spaces for shorter and more limited and thoughtful conversations, as opposed to having an expert on everything. I personally think Jack of all trades or Jill of all trades are the same effective, if not more effective, within communities for culture change. I'm also of the opinion that culture change is really, really slow. And so we have these expectations, especially now that people change their attitudes when we provide them with information. And we just don't, human beings don't operate that way. So how do I also move upstream to go, our community standard is this. You can have whatever standard you want in your home. That these are your rights as a person, and that's fine, but we have community and cultural standards associated with that. Is that helpful? I don't know. I think your question is one of my favorite ever, because it forces us to start going, let's brainstorm and sit down and think about how to do this in a better, more effective way that uses less resources, less people, less money that we all don't have. They don't put any money towards prevention, so we end up trying to scrounge for scraps as a bunch of organizations. How can we work together better to effect change without, putting a few people, stressing a few people out of work. I mean, there's also one of the things I often say too is the attrition rate of educators in this field is very high. I mean, it's at every DV shelter, rape crisis shelter, most of the educators don't last more than 2 to 5 years. And it's because it's also a really hard job. And you're not paid enough. And there's oftentimes very few resources of people inviting you in for all the reasons you talked about, Janet. It's such a great question. But I also say there's some really cool stuff that we're figuring out now, thanks to research and people's hard work to do this stuff better.
So did you get all I was booted off for a minute, Jamie. So all the questions in the chat were addressed.
I think so. I know Reagan talked about college orientation, if that's something that they address, or if they do it in more bite-sized pieces, and then just agreed that making space for these conversations is very uncomfortable or taboo in some cultures. So definitely thinking about that.
And working within those communities, it's such an important point. And working with the members of those communities to figure out how to have that. You know, it's funny, I had someone say to me once, like, I just can't believe they won't talk about this it was a refugee community. I just can't believe they won't talk about it. And you're like, they will. They just have to do it differently. And it's probably not going to meet your standards, which is fine too. But like, you know, everybody's in it. Yeah, I keep thinking of just like a trans theoretical model, stages of change. Like, is someone ready to talk about this? Do we need to move forward and go, oh, they're not ready, so let's prepare them for talking about this? That's just as important a place to be. That like, how do we start to bring this apart? And, you know, yeah, one of the things I would say too is someone bringing up college and university is a great example, because they are under a lot of pressure to dot I's and cross T's and make sure they've said things. And that is oftentimes far more important than actually getting something done or sending a message or effecting change, because they have a real financial liability now that they did not have, thanks to a whole bunch of people doing a bunch of great work. So how do we also start to go, like, what does accountability look like for your effectiveness, not just you covering the topic? And then what does it mean after that first day of orientation? Like, I always like to say, University of Maryland had a great orientation program, and they still did not have a relationship with those bars that made those bars not do drink specials in the same way. You know, like, what a cool thing if the university had actually communicated with those bar owners and started to set up a relationship to say, we want our students to use your bar. We know that's okay. And we have students who are over 21. We also want students to not drink themselves to death. So how do we, you know, how do we meet middle? So, and there really is cool, innovative things that are happening in that way. But
Right.
It's fun hanging out with y'all.
I know, Marty.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I know your time is limited, but we appreciate you coming on and working with us again. You've been really impactful to our group and those who have participated over the last 8 months or so.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you all. I love what you all are doing with this group, and I think it is fairly innovative compared to where a lot of places are. So you're helping out our state, for those of you in Utah, and other places for those of you not. So thank you. If anybody has questions, I'm at the health department, and my email is, you can find me. So feel free to reach out. Thanks so much.
Excellent.